In the late 1960s, Australia was embroiled in the Vietnam War, capping off a generation of conflict in the West Pacific region. France, meanwhile, was just starting its first period of peace in a generation, organizing in the metropole to prepare for war against the Soviets. You might ask what these two have in common. Well, other than screwing around in Indochina, they just happened to have my favorite squad organization setups ever at the time. The Australians on one side, combining Commonwealth organizational style with a Pacific twist with some American equipment, and the French on the other doing whatever the French do, and despite that, they had a lot of similarities. In this video, I'm going to compare the organization and equipment of Australia's rifle section and France's combat group in the late 60s and early 70s. Since I'm in a bit of a French time of my life, as my Instagram followers can attest, let's start with the French squad. But first, thanks to my patrons and members who make these videos you guys watch possible. This week's featured task force is the 13th Air Mobile. My wife chose their mascot, so it has to be your favorite too. I don't make the rules. Viewer support now makes up most of Battle Order's revenue. Supporters get access to exclusive videos and my private Discord server where I post research and works in progress every day. Check it out at the link in my description, and I'll see you over there. The French were running an ungodly mess of small arms in the 1950s. An eclectic mix of French and British rifles, US M1 carbines, and even German weapons for operations in its colonial theaters, and a largely US-equipped force stationed in Germany, M1 Garins for the best of the best, and a lot of M1917s and M1903s for everyone else. The only real constant was by 1955, they had received about 188,000 MAT-49 submachine guns, so those were common everywhere. Squad and platoon organizations were similarly split between theaters, with a relatively conventional structure for service in Europe and something a little more novel for service in Indochina and Algeria. However, after France's withdrawal from Algeria and the adoption of their new Model 1959 division, both their armaments and organizational situations stabilized. They were finally producing enough domestic arms and combat vehicles to phase out many of the World War II era and American-supplied infantry arms in service. This organization applied to the mountain infantry of the Alpine Chasseurs, the parachute infantry, and the commando companies under the Territorial Forces Infantry Regiments, or RIFT. The squad consisted of 10 men overall. They were led by a sergeant, the only NCO in the squad. At this time, professional volunteer sergeants were signified with 2 stripes, while conscript sergeants had 1 stripe. Squad and platoon leaders were equipped with PP-8 or PP-11 handy-talkie style radios, which is often seen in period footage worn on the chest. The platoon leader's radio operator also had a Prick-10 or PP-13 manpack radio. The remainder were split into a fire team as the principal supporting fire and anti-tank element, and a shock team as the maneuver element. The Model 1967 era seems to be when they formalized this fire and shock team terminology. Both teams were led by a corporal or chief corporal. The squad leader and shock team leaders were armed with the MAT-49 submachine guns, the real infantryman's weapon in the assault. The fire team leader, meanwhile, was armed with the MOS-49-56 semi-automatic rifle. This was a modification of the original MOS-49 with a cut-down forend and the ability to fire NATO standard 22mm rifle grenades. Despite looking like some sort of carbine, the 49-56 was only 8 centimeters or about 3 inches shorter. The fire team further consisted of an LRAC or rocket launcher gunner, LRAC loader, automatic rifle gunner, and automatic rifle loader. The rocket launcher was the Model 1950 LRAC 73mm, which is perhaps the most G.I. Joe looking bazooka ever. The LRAC gunner was armed with a MAC-50 pistol as well. The loader was armed with the MOS-49-56 at this time. Both he and the gunner carried big 3-tube backpacks for their rockets. As for the automatic rifleman, by this point, the AA-52 general-purpose machine gun was the new standard, replacing the FM-2429 and M1918A2 BAR, which were used in nearly the same number in the 1950s. The FM or automatic rifle version of the AA-52 had a lighter profile barrel and was to be used from a bipod, whereas the light machine gun variant that replaced the US M1919 was the same gun with a heavier profile barrel. It was intended for use from a tripod or as a vehicle machine gun. However, the squad AA-52 could also be used from a tripod, especially when one squad was used in a supporting fire role during a platoon attack. His loader was also armed with a rifle. Although ammo load guidelines should be taken with a grain of salt, they'll depend on the situation more than anything else. The 1973 manual lists the gunner carrying 200 rounds for the AA-52 as well as a pistol, the loader carrying 400 rounds, and the fire team leader carrying 150 rounds. The shock team meanwhile had the team leader and 3 grenadier voltigeurs. One GV was armed with a submachine gun, while the other 2 had Moss 4956s. These 2 riflemen were the squad's designated rifle grenadiers. Each theoretically prescribed 2 anti-personnel grenades, 2 anti-tank grenades, and 1 signal flare each. To compare how the squads behaved on the battlefield, let's start with the basic tactical formations. For the French, these were the column, the line, and the double column. The squad column provided a good pace and was well suited to moving along a route, infiltrations, and during nighttime. The shock team would lead the formation while the fire team would be in the rear, with the squad leader in between. Whenever possible, the teams would be deployed in a swarm, which entailed the teams spread out, with submachine gunners leading and the team leader roughly towards the center. It wasn't exactly a wedge or diamond, but filled a similar niche as an intermediary between column and line. This dispersion would reduce the leading element's vulnerability to frontal fire, a weak point of the column formation, increase observation in all directions both when moving and stationary, and clear slightly more ground on the squad's flanks. During movement, the shock team would often be labeled as scouts. However, if terrain was unsuitable, the shock team would also move in column. It's basically the difference between the US Army's open and closed squad column formations of World War II. Alternatively, the squad could move in double column. Here, the shock team is pictured in swarm on the squad's left, while the fire team is in swarm on the right, with the machine gun and rocket launcher towards the center. When compared to a column, the double column increased the squad's overall security by pushing out riflemen to the flanks while still maintaining a reasonable pace in suitable terrain. It also reduced their vulnerability to frontal fire and increased the amount of cleared ground. However, I gather this formation would be harder to control, and as a result, it was recommended for infiltrations during the day rather than night. Lastly, the line formation entailed the squad moving in a single rank, hot dog style if you will. The main advantage of the line was reducing vulnerability to frontal fire, making it ideal during the assault. It was also to be used when occupying a linear piece of cover like a trench or a wall. Interestingly, Cold War manuals state the line was ideal for crossing a ridge, road, gap, or strip of land. Given the line is most vulnerable to flanking fire, they probably weren't as concerned with linear danger areas actively covered by a machine gun and more concerned with reducing the time the unit took crossing it. Although, depending on the situation, the shock team could be used in a much more cautious way, scouting out dangerous terrain before the fire team crossed, which I'll explain in a bit. This structure allowed for binomes of 2 men, one with an SMG and one with a rifle as a task organization. For maintaining security on the move, the SMG man would generally lead while the rifleman followed, providing longer range coverage. When occupying a static position, the SMG man would focus on surveilling the closest 0 to 50 meters, while the rifleman would cover 50 to 300 meters. Veterans online sometimes refer to the men with the submachine guns as GVs on point or lead GVs. They were also more senior, meaning each binome had a de facto leader. If the squad needed to cross unknown exposed ground and they weren't in contact, the squad leader could choose to move the squad in 3 bounds. The leading binome could be the first to cross alone to scout under the cover of the squad. Once they gave the all clear, the rest of the shock team and squad leader would go, followed by the fire team. Crossing a bridge would be similar. The squad machine gun would be placed in a support by fire position, while the rocket team would be placed in security looking down the length of the bridge and across the road. The scouts from the shock team meanwhile would move towards the abutment under the fire team's overwatch. 2 or 3 voltigeurs would rush across the bridge and establish far side security. The remainder of the shock team would examine the underside of the bridge. Both elements would be examining the bridge to see if there are any signs the bridge has been rigged with explosives. If it's safe, the fire team would follow. However, as the squad was essentially configured into self-contained binomes under the squad leader, with an extra fire team leader to maintain detailed control over the support by fire element, the rocket team in particular didn't always have to be co-located with the fire team. For example, if assaulting a structure in a built-up area, the fire team leader may set up the AA-52 binome perpendicular to the assault line to place the structure under fire. The rest of the squad may then flank. From the direction of the assault, the LRAC could be used to blow a hole in the building's wall or door, after which the squad leader takes the 2 shock binomes into the building. The platoon's command group also had 3 marksmen with FR-F1 sniper rifles. These weren't necessarily attached to the squads as vehicle seating charts show them in the command group, however, it was enough to attach 1 per squad notionally. The French went back and forth over the decades between having the marksmen in the command group or directly in the squads, and it even differed during the same period. In mechanized units, they were in 2 of 3 squads organically, for example. Now, why do I think this is great? Well, 1, everything looks like it's out of Star Wars. French stuff is always very distinctive, and using a general-purpose machine gun that isn't a MAG, M60, or MG42 sets them apart by itself. Second, combining submachine guns and rifle grenadiers in the maneuver element for fire supremacy in the last 100 meters without fully sacrificing coverage and explosive projection out to 300 meters is also very cool. The LRAC 73, it could be more aesthetic, I must acknowledge, but by this point the LRAC 89mm was right around the corner anyway. And of course, naming subunits shock and fire teams is just peak. The French seem to have agreed, because even though they replaced this structure in the 1970s with one based exclusively on the FAMAS and the rocket launcher of the day, with machine guns sidelined highlighting the armor threat specifically and the use of vehicle-mounted machine guns, units often continued using the shock and fire team framework. Now onto the Australians, who shared some similarities, but at the end of the day came from the British way of doing things. As I was going through the sources, I noticed the doctrinal version of the rifle section at the time did not have the same equipment that was used in Vietnam. For example, it lists M551 Sheridans, which Australia was testing but ultimately didn't adopt, and the XM571, cute little guy club member. Yeah, I forgot about the club for a little bit. However, it didn't mention the M16, M72, or M79, which were Vietnam staples by this point. So what I'm going to do is cover the doctrinal version first, and then how it changed in Vietnam, because the Australians went on to integrate the Vietnamisms into their official doctrine anyway. But if you see anyone in the comments saying the doctrinal version wasn't how it was like in Vietnam, it's your duty as a true battle order soldier to tell them I said the same thing. Like the French light infantry squad, the Australian rifle section, called an assault section in the 1967 manual, consisted of 10 men. They were led by a corporal as section commander in British fashion, and were split into a scout group, gun group, and a rifle group. Imagining a section moving in single file from right to left, the groups are ordered how they would be in formation, with the scouts leading and the riflemen trailing. The number 1 scout at the head of the formation was listed here as armed with an F1 submachine gun. Although the doctrinal successor to the Owen machine carbine used earlier in Vietnam, the F1 wasn't used in this role by infantry in Vietnam itself. It was used more for cordon and search missions in villages, rear area security, and by support troops, and in domestic training, which is what this manual would have been for. The number 2 scout was armed with an L1A1 SLR, the Commonwealth version of the FNFAL. Following them was the section commander, who was armed with an F1 submachine gun as well. Immediately following the section commander was the gun group. This was directly under the leadership of the section's second in command, or 2IC, who was a lance corporal armed with an SLR. The number 1 machine gunner was armed with an M60 medium machine gun, designated a general-purpose machine gun in Australian service. Although one might assume otherwise, this wasn't actually a Vietnam exclusive. The decision was made in December of 1959 to procure it over the MAG-58 without a trial. Basically, the director of infantry had gone to the US, liked it, and they'd be able to get them quicker, so they cancelled a test order of mags in favor of just adopting the M60, a very vibes-based decision. The L2A1 automatic rifle was also in Australian service, but unlike the Canadians, it wasn't usually used as the infantry's machine gun. It was officially a combat support weapon. The number 2 machine gunner was also armed with an SLR. Lastly, the rifle group consisted of 4 riflemen. Although the section commander was not directly part of the rifle group, he would usually lead them directly in the assault while he delegated supporting fire to the 2IC. Doctrinally, each rifleman would be armed with an SLR. Further, 2 would get L1A2 rifle grenade dischargers for launching number 94 Energa anti-tank rifle grenades. Each is listed as carrying 2, although stuff like ammo is task organizable. The MA, or Carl Gustav recoilless rifle, was designated as a platoon-level weapon doctrinally. However, the proposed support section did not exist in practice. If we compare this to what the French had going on, you can see the similarities. dedicated fire support and maneuver elements, mixing submachine guns with rifles, with the SMG being used to lead formations and provide close security, the use of rifle grenades for anti-tank duties among riflemen. The most stark difference is the Australians had formalized the use of a scout group as a result of decades of experience fighting in the Southwest Pacific area, whereas the French favored a rocket launcher team due to the armor threat in Europe. Although the British didn't go so far as to formalize it for their Europe-centric force, they also used it in places like Malaya. The scout group was really necessary for a lot of the jungle environments Australia found itself in, as situational awareness in the dark, dense foliage was heavily degraded and sections would be forced into columns. They needed someone to stay hyper-vigilant of the enemy and literally clear a path through the vegetation. The number 2 scout would back up the number 1, and also maintain the connection between him and the section commander. This was important enough to be a full-time job, although the Australians tended to cycle section members through the role as well, as it was particularly exhausting. That's one of the reasons the SMG was handy. It was more compact and about 1.5 pounds lighter than an SLR loaded. Being a fully automatic weapon also made it preferable for close quarters fighting. However, the equipment situation was significantly different in Vietnam. The foundation was the same. Most men were still armed with SLRs and the M60 was still the section automatic. However, very early into Australia's involvement into Vietnam, the M16 replaced the Owen machine carbine within the infantry. This was initially done on a somewhat informal basis, the outgoing battalion passing down its armalite to the incoming battalion. At the Battle of Long Tan, 6 RIR had some XM16E1s passed down from 1 RIR, and after that battle, Major Harry Smith requested to have all of their Owens replaced with the Armalites, with the Owens to be transferred to the 1st Australian Support Group at Vung Tau. Seems the French had similar ideas, because 1967 is the year the FAMAS program started, and looking at instructional footage from the 1970s and 1980s, they sure did like using the FAMAS like an SMG. The M16 became more formal after the Americans standardized on the M16A1, but they'd still only be available for deployed or deploying Australian units until 1969 or a little after, which is probably why they're absent from the 1967 manual. A common task organization was to give the number 2 scout an M16 as well, because the two would often switch positions and it was easier than swapping weapons and ammo. For the same reason, it wasn't uncommon for riflemen to be so armed as well, aside from its utility as a lighter, more controllable weapon. The other major difference is the Australians adopted 2 American inventions to use in place of the Energa. First, the lead rifleman was designated Grenadier and initially armed with a standalone M79 40mm grenade launcher. From around 1970 or 1971, this could also be replaced by an M16A1 with an underbarrel M203. Second, for anti-tank, or more importantly in the context of Vietnam, anti-bunker roles, the M72 law was issued. As the M72 was considered a munition, it wasn't as prescriptive as the small arms. Anyone except for perhaps the lead scout could have one, but an average figure would generally be 2 per section give or take, going to the rifleman. Highly situational though. To see how this section would work in a tactical situation, let's start with the 5 basic formations. Single file, staggered file, open file, arrowhead, and extended line. In a single file, the scout group would lead the section, followed by the section commander, the gun group, and the rifle group. The single file was well suited to linear features, such as narrow tracks, ditches, and creek beds. It was the easiest to control, especially in the jungle with extremely limited sight lines. It was fast, quieter since everyone wasn't breaking their own trail, and was the least vulnerable to flanking fire. However, it was vulnerable to frontal fire and limited the amount of frontal fire they could produce without redeploying. The order of the squad in the single file would be similar in the staggered file and open file. The staggered file was on a slightly wider front, with 2 columns of men moving on either side of a track but still in the path of the leading scouts. This may be used when visibility was still limited, but not so restricted as to require a single file. The open file, meanwhile, was basically a more compact version of the staggered file. Considering that any path wide enough to move in 2 columns was a likely enemy fire lane, or in modern terms a linear danger area, the placement of the gun and rifle groups on either side of the track meant they could deploy into their contact drill positions without crossing the track. The section commander would move on the same side of the track as the rifle group, as he would lead the assault himself. When moving in open country, an arrowhead formation could be used, which was like an open file but angled out the rifle and gun groups, and the scouts moved in file, with the rear scout 1 tactical bound ahead of the section commander. While more vulnerable to flanking fire than a file and more difficult to control, making it very difficult for night movement and in areas with limited sightlines, it was less vulnerable to the frontal fire that was more likely when moving through clearings. It was also good for overall fire production and cleared more ground, and similar to open file, contact drill positions were easily reached. And lastly, during the assault, the section would deploy into an extended line. This formation was the most vulnerable to flanking fire, but was a risk worth taking because in the final assault, the threat to the front was top priority. It was least vulnerable to frontal fire, and best at producing its own frontal fire and at bayonet fighting. Now with that in mind, the most classic vignette is their contact drill. Drills were basically automatic reactions done without orders to allow the section to regain the initiative and allow follow-on actions, basically to overcome the initial surprise. During a drill, each of the section's subunits had a part to play. The two priorities were getting fire going at the enemy as quick as possible and getting everyone into a position where the section commander could exert control. Note this drill was generally only used in close country. In open terrain, the section commander would likely be able to see about as much as the scouts, and the enemy would generally be at least 100 or more meters away. Further, if the terrain or situation didn't fit the drill, the section commander could cancel it and issue orders. It was meant to fit the average situation. Assuming the section is moving in single file through jungle terrain, let's presume they run into an enemy in front who knows they're there. The scouts immediately shout contact front and everyone repeats. The scouts go to ground, either to the left of the section's line of travel or on the lower ground side. They return fire and assess the enemy's disposition. The section commander goes to ground within voice contact of the scouts, but to their rear so he can gain information without getting pinned down. The gun group meanwhile doubles forward to inline with the scouts, either on the right side of the line of travel or on the higher ground side. They begin firing in the direction of the enemy's positions. The rifle group doubles forward and takes position behind the section commander to await orders. If they're to commence an assault, the rifle group will be the core, so they want to maintain their freedom to move. At this point, the drill was finished, and any follow-on actions would be the section commander's decision to make depending on the information they could gather. The contact rear situation would be similar, except the last two riflemen would take the role the scouts played in a contact front. They'd go to ground on the left or lower ground side, while the rest of the rifle group would go to ground in place. The section commander would double back to just behind the last two riflemen, the MG would move to the right or the higher ground, and the scouts would double back to join up with the unengaged riflemen to act as the likely assault element. To make a final comparison of the French and Australian methods, overall the concepts were very similar. They both had dedicated assault and support elements, the squad leader generally led the assault, both employed scouts, and both employed general-purpose machine guns and submachine guns, although in Australia, the M16 filled the role as a much more capable replacement of the submachine gun, much like the French would do with the FAMAS. If we really get down to the bottom of it, I'd say the core differences have to do with culture and operational environment. To engage in a bit of stereotype, the Australians really maintain that British rifleman spirit with the SLR, while the French bought more into submachine guns for that elan factor in the assault. Older Australian, British, and American guys talk about the stopping power of 7.62 battle rifles, the French talk about the last 300 meters. Environmentally though, the real difference was the French prioritized anti-armor fire due to the Soviet threat and combat in stone and brick villages, where obstacles and buildings need to be reduced with rockets, while the Australians structurally optimized for the jungle environment. You could argue the SLR wasn't especially optimal, but we'll leave that to one side. I'm a force structure guy, not a gun guy. It should be noted that when France was operating in Indochina and Algeria, they weren't giving every squad a rocket launcher. The M72 functioned as an adequate, light, section-level bunker reduction weapon in the jungle. A heavy crew-served rocket launcher eating into the bayonet strength just wouldn't be a worthwhile trade-off in that environment. The French squad would only get more anti-tank heavy as the decades went on, with squad weapons like the LRAC 89mm and RAC 112 Apelas, only walking back to squad AT4s after the Cold War, but by that point it was becoming a very different army. The Australian section meanwhile stayed largely similar until the late 2000s except for updates to the small arms. Further, as demonstrated in the segments on tactical movement, the French still functionally used scouts. They just did it more like the Cold War British, tasking 2 riflemen from the rifle group to the duty, just with weapons more closely resembling the Australian scout group. In any case, the French and Australians were certainly more similar to each other than either were with the Cold War US Marines and Army, who had adopted their admittedly pioneering identical fireteam structures in 1944 and 1956 respectively. I'm not saying it's bad, the entire Anglosphere moved to it eventually for a reason, but they are definitely kind of boring. However, the US completely botched their automatic rifle replacement. M14s and M16s with bipods were simply inadequate, so they had to task organize squads with M60 medium machine guns for basically 2 decades. At least they got an early win with 5.56 though. If you found this informative, you'd love what's over on my Patreon. Patrons and channel members get access to exclusive videos, Discord server access where I post my research and works in progress, and other benefits. I'll see you over there.